So, by now, you've hopefully realized that game design is a very broad field. Systems designers tend to be analytical and usually take lots of classes in math, and they usually know at least some programming. Story writers tend to know and practice a lot of creative writing. Level designers often study architecture, since it's the study of designing physical spaces and how humans encounter them. So, this week, let's talk about space.
Now, you might have noticed that we're spending 2 weeks on this, and this week is labeled PvE. This is short for player versus environment, as opposed to PvP or player versus player. PvP games are when players are playing against other players as opponents, and so, for example, first-person shooters, fighting games, battle royale games, sports games, and other multiplayer competitive experiences. What we're talking about this week, PvE, instead means the player or players are working against the system itself, and any enemies are being controlled by the game or the computer. PvE games are either single player, or if they are multiplayer, they're cooperative, with everyone working toward a common goal. The process for designing levels is actually quite a bit different, depending on whether a game is PvP or PvE. This week we're going to talk about PvE first, so just keep in mind that everything I'm saying here is specific to games where you are either alone or working together with friends to navigate a space in pursuit of some kind of goal, like to beat the game, and that this is specific to games where you're moving through a design space in the first place. So not all games even have levels that need to be designed, but enough do that this is something that a lot of game designers have chosen to specialize in. So first thing to realize with level design is that levels are a form of content in the game. There are other kinds of content, like NPCs, character dialogue. Many games have long lists of weapons and equipment and items and enemy types, each with their own stats. All of that is content. And levels are a very special type of content because, unlike those other types, you actually walk through a level. But it is still content. And I mentioned this because of when content is designed in a project. So let's take a step back and first talk about the game development process in general. So, way back in the second module, I showed you this. If you've forgotten, the idea is that game designers don't really know what we're doing when we're innovating by making new games. There's always some risk that will make something that isn't as fun as we thought it would be. And so we solve this by making the parts of a game that we're unsure about very quickly and cheaply in what we call a prototype. And then we playtest that prototype and analyze the results of the playtest to find out whether the game's meeting its design goals or where it's falling short. And then we go back and iteratively modify the design, modify the prototype, playtest again, keep going like that. Now, back when I was speaking very broadly and oversimplified this a bit, because of the actual process of fully making a game goes through multiple loops like this. Initially, we might just make small prototypes that aren't even the full game, just a small piece of the game that we're unsure of. As we gain certainty of the game that we want to make and what it will be like, we'll start building larger parts of the game with a bit more confidence and adding some content, and then if that continues to work, we add still more stuff. So for example, if we were building a side-scrolling platformer, early on we might just make a very simple prototype that doesn't even have any art and not much gameplay and just shows jumping physics so we can get the controls feeling good. There aren't even any levels here, just a screen or two to run and jump around on. And then maybe once we have that working, we might decide on some of the mechanics. Maybe there will be some combat and a tech tree, so we'll implement some enemies and some tech that the player might unlock later, so now we've got a little bit of content in the form of enemies and attacks and special moves that the player can use. And we'll test those, again, probably in a single room or two, just to get the combat part of the game feeling good. And then after that, maybe we'll flesh out a bit more of the mechanics, design some more enemies and more of the tech tree, and test those out. And at this point, maybe we'll start designing some levels. Maybe not the final level that'll appear in the game, but just small pieces. Maybe some small rooms that use the enemies to build what we hope are interesting tactical situations. To get a feel for whether things like a small platform with an enemy on it is more challenging or frustrating or impossible, or the difference between encountering an enemy in open terrain compared to tight spaces, and generally just creating some interesting mini experiences like specific encounters in differently shaped areas. And then at some point we'll have all the mechanics in place, we'll have a good sense of how most of the attacks and enemies work, and this is where we'd be designing the final game levels and taking those interesting encounters from before and putting them in a larger space in a larger context. And the story is also content that's being worked on at the same time as part of the same process. So basically what I'm saying here is that levels have a lot of dependencies. Dependencies is a term that we use in games to mean that you can't do something until something else is done first. So you can't design the levels of a game until a bunch of other stuff is already in place. So for example, creating a level when you don't have mechanics, most cases is meaningless. Imagine creating a level for a platformer, but you don't know how high and how far the main character can jump. Well, if you don't know that, then you have no way of creating a level with any kind of pit to jump over because you don't even know if the player can cross it yet. A great example of this is an older game called Bionic Commando. This was a platformer where you could not jump at all, but you did have this bionic arm that you could use to swing around off of the ceiling. Needless to say, the levels in Bionic Commando had to be designed very carefully to deal with this kind of interaction. If you took a level of Bionic Commando and tried to use it instead as a level in a more traditional platformer like Mario or Mega Man or Castlevania, it wouldn't work. Like, some Bionic Commando levels involve just doing a lot of extra work to cross a one-block wide pit that Mario could have easily jumped over. Other levels may have involved swinging long distances across the ceiling in a way that Mega Man wouldn't have been able to do at all. So you can see that the mechanics inform the level design. You want to create levels in a way that encourage players to really interface with the mechanics, so you need to know the mechanics first before you can design the levels to showcase them. Similarly, you'll want a pretty good idea of the kinds of content that are in the game. What kinds of enemies and environmental hazards do you have to play around with? A great example of how content informs level design would be Half-Life 2. In this game, you get a unique weapon, the gravity gun. And in playtesting, Valve found that people really liked playing around with the gravity gun weapon, so much that originally the player acquired it about 3/4 of the way through the game, and they changed it to let the player get the gravity gun much earlier in the game. Now it happens about 1/3 of the way through the game instead. But if you have a gravity gun, it drastically changes how you approach every tactical situation. So then they had to go through a lot of different levels in the middle of the game and modify them with the knowledge that the player now has a gravity gun, and so a lot of the challenges that they designed no longer worked. The game Portal, also by Valve, also introduced the concept of this portal gun that could shoot 2 doorways that are interconnected, and all the levels in that game were also designed entirely to deal with a player that can now connect 2 arbitrary surfaces with a doorway between them. So the levels had to be designed specifically to showcase that ability and force the player to use it in interesting ways. Levels are also often designed, at least part of the story is in place. So when a level designer is given a level to design for a professional game, they're often given a spec, like, this level is chapter 8 in the game, here's where the story is at the start of the level, here are the major plot points that have to happen during or inside this level, here's where the level ends. So you know what content is available to the player coming in, you know what their weapons and abilities and everything that they can do, you know what enemies and environmental hazards and other challenges they have encountered before, and maybe the lead designer has also decided that there are 1 or 2 new things that the player must encounter and learn about in this specific level. And they'll probably also have an idea of things like what the total game length is and how much of that the player should spend in this level. So they might, for example, say a typical playthrough of this level on a first encounter should take about 30 minutes, and it should be the most difficult level the player has experienced so far, so some failure points are acceptable. There might also be a specific design intent, like this is a specific type of level meant to showcase a specific type of play. For example, maybe this is an underwater level meant to deal with the challenge of slow movement and low maneuverability, or this is a minecart level where everything is super fast-paced and on rails, or this is a dungeon level with tight spaces and a maze of twisty passages all alike. And now as the level designer, you're given this spec, and within those constraints, you have to make a space that contains those things somehow. So you can see that by the time you get around to designing an entire level that will be in the final game, it's usually pretty late in the process already. This is not something that happens early on in development, because lots of other things have to be in place first. So if you're doing the design of an entire game, you might want to think first about the sequence of levels. How many levels are there? How are they connected? What's the main idea of each level in terms of what it introduces to the player, and what kinds of unique experiences it offers or builds on that are different from the previous levels in the game. So there are some high-level questions that the level designer should be asking in general about any particular level. First is going back to what we talked about. What is the core of the game again? Like overall, we've talked about the pillars of the game and the core of the game before. Like, what is this game about? What are its unique points that make the experience for the player? And when you're thinking about what is the main idea of a level, you often want to think about how that level supports the core of the game. As one example, the original Sonic the Hedgehog was a game about going fast. The core of the game was a platformer where your main character could run really fast, and most of the game was designed around this. A lot of game levels had ramps and long straight spaces where you could just go really fast. And in the first game, one of the most infamous and hated levels of the game was the underwater level. And partly that was just because it was hard, but in large part it was because when you were underwater, you couldn't run, and so it slowed you down. This level contrasted with everything else in the game up to that point and made for a very unique and memorable moments because the player lost a lot of their speed and maneuverability that they were used to and had to find a way to cope with that. But it also meant that they couldn't go fast, so the entire idea of that level was fighting against the core experience that sold the game. So it is useful to go back to your basic core and pillar statement when starting with a level to see if the main idea of the level even makes sense for this game. Next is to consider the main character and their pillars, by which I mean, what is positive and aspirational about who the main character is? As a player, why am I playing this character? What do I want to do? For example, if the main character is Batman, well, what do most players expect to do if they're Batman? I mean, if you've seen any Batman movies or TV shows or read the comics, most of the fun of being Batman is either dropping yourself into a group of street thugs and beating them up, or going against one of Gotham City's colorful supervillains and beating them up. So, as Batman, if I were in a game about being Batman, I would expect to be able to throw a decent punch, move fluidly, get involved with group combats against large numbers of weak enemies, or single combat against my nemesis, and have a utility belt with a bunch of cool high-tech gadgets. So if you're designing a game with Batman, you would want to design levels and spaces where the player gets to do those kinds of things. A Spider-Man game is probably going to involve swinging on webs between high-rise buildings. One of the reasons Superman 64 for this is so often cited in lists of worst games ever is not that it was a terrible game on its own, but that the aspirational thing about being Superman is the idea of having tons of cool powers, like the ability to fly, have cold breath, heat vision, near invulnerability. And in that game, you played as a Superman who was stuck in a city full of kryptonite fog who lost most of his powers. And when he could use his powers, it was only in a very limited way. So it didn't really feel like you were playing Superman at all. And even if you're not using a licensed character, it's still worth asking, like, what's cool about my main character? What is the appeal of the fantasy of being that character, so that you can think about what kinds of levels enable the player to take on that fantasy. And similarly, you want to think about the player's actual capabilities in the game. The way that the player is given choice and agency, and their ability to express themselves as the main character. You know, when we talk about verbs, what is it that the main character can do? What can the player do to influence the game, and what happens when they do it, right? You want to think about designing experiences and situations that complement the player verbs. If, for example, you give the player the ability to jump, and then you put them in a closed space with low ceilings so they can't jump at all, well, that really doesn't take advantage of the mechanics. Or maybe you give the player wide open spaces with plenty of room to jump, but all of the things they have to collect are on the ground, so there's no reason for them to jump. Again, that's not really taking advantage. Now give the player something dangerous on the ground, like a crawling enemy or a pit or some spikes or lava that they have to jump over. Now you've given them a reason to jump, so they will engage with the jumping mechanics. And if jumping feels good and is the main appeal of the game, you'll want to be thinking in general about how to design spaces that encourage the player to jump a lot or jump in interesting ways. And you could apply this to any other core mechanic. If the main mechanic of the game, if the main verb that the player wants to do that's really satisfying is shooting, then you want to give them things to shoot, right? If the main verb is flying, you want to give them things to fly through, right? So always think about what the player can do. Now, as you design a level, you want to think about the pacing of the level. What this means is how intense is the action, or how difficult is the navigation at each point. You usually want the pacing to vary. Flat pacing, where everything is the exact same challenge level throughout, will feel pretty boring. And a smooth upward curve, where it gets a little bit harder over time, but in a very smooth way, is also kind of boring and predictable, and also increases intensity up to a breaking point. So usually you want there to be peaks and valleys in the game, where sometimes the game gets more intense, then it lets up, then a little bit more intense, and then it lets up again. Give the player a challenge, then give them some room to breathe. But trending upwards, where the challenges do tend to get more intense over time, but still with some breathing room in between. So for example, this is why in games with levels, you often see an encounter like, say, a bunch of enemies in a room, but then once the players killed those enemies, they're free to examine the room and even walk down a corridor to the next room with nothing else attacking them, so that they can gather themselves, do a little victory dance, or just breathe a little. Now, this is going to sound evil, but a lot of level design is really about manipulating the player to do what you want them to do. Yes, we can drop the player into an open world, and in theory they can go wherever they want, but you would be amazed at just how many players will go exactly where you want them to, as if you are controlling the player and not the other way around, if you design your spaces right. Theme park design is a great example of how people can be manipulated to be drawn through a space the way you want them to. If you've ever been to a well-designed theme park, especially a Disney park, it's nearly impossible to get lost, because no matter where you are, there are at least a few highly visible landmarks that you can see from anywhere in the park, and that you can use to orient yourself. Guests will also tend to walk towards those landmarks in the absence of any other ideas for what to do, which means that park designers can put specific points of interest along the paths that lead to those landmarks. So for example, there might be a castle up ahead, so you're walking that way, but then you notice a ride to your left, so you get on that ride. But now, when you exit that ride, you're exiting somewhere different from where you entered, and so now you're moving along a different path. Levels in video games can work like this too, where in theory the player can go anywhere, they have full agency, but in reality there are some landmarks that are drawing them in, and you can design the space so they will go towards them. So for example, if you want the player to go in a certain direction at the beginning of a level, best way to do that is to have them facing that direction, place a clear walking path in front of them, and put something in the distance that looks like it would be interesting to see up close. You can use turns and intersections to draw a player's attention as well. For example, if you have them walking down a hallway, and then you have them reach a bend that forces them to turn to the left, as soon as they reach that bend, you know they're going to face left, and they will see whatever's in that direction, so you can use turns to force a player's view in a specific direction. There was one game, for example, that a much older game that started out in a very large round room with no enemies, just to get the player used to the mechanics of just being able to move around in a space at all. But the developers found in early testing that a lot of the players had trouble even getting out of this first room, because it was large enough, it was this large circular area, you couldn't see all the way around to the other side, and there was only one doorway. So players would kind of go wander aimlessly throughout this and not be able to find the one door. Their solution was super simple. They started the player facing the direction that the exit was, and they placed this red carpet on the floor, leading straight ahead to the door. So now all of a sudden, everyone was able to find the exit immediately, and in fact most players didn't even bother exploring the rest of the room because they now had a path to follow. But if they did head off that path, it was very easy to find your way back on because the red carpet was very visible from everywhere else in the room. So when we think about story, normally we're thinking in terms of either written story or a story that's conveyed in dialogue or cutscenes. A level designer does have to think about these, like if there's a non-interactive cutscene, where do you put the trigger for that so that it knows where to start? But there's another way to tell a story that doesn't take control from the player, and that's less expensive to implement than a full cinematic, and that can feel better integrated with the gameplay. And this is the story that's told by the visual space around you. For example, imagine in real life, not even in a game, you walk into a house that you've never been in before, and you don't know who lived there. And say the occupant isn't around. And someone told you that the person who lives there is either an 80-year-old widowed great-grandmother, or a busy middle-aged couple with 4 kids, or a 25-year-old bachelor. You would probably be able to take a really good guess which one that is, if you're just in their house. Why? Well, because those people are going to decorate their spaces very differently. If you see a bunch of small toy cars randomly on the ground, probably it means the residents have kids. If you see a big fridge filled with beer, and not so much food, and a stereo system and TV that fill up half the wall, that's a bachelor pad. What's hanging on the walls? Is it pictures of people who are probably that person's relative, meaning that family is important to them? Is it a bunch of expensive wall art by famous artists that makes it looks like it's there mostly to show off how wealthy the person is? Is it a bunch of posters of music bands? Is the space messy or clean? Is there a pet bowl for a dog or cat? Right? Every item in a person's living space tells a little story about the people who live there. And your levels in games are like that too. So think about what kinds of objects and decorations might be in this level. If you put two different objects next to each other, that can imply a connection between them. If you want to give the player more information about the characters that inhabit your world, you can put lived-in domestic spaces there, so players can discover more about who lives there. If you want really good examples of how so much story can be told purely with visual art, games in the walking sim genre like Gone Home or What Remains of Edith Finch are great examples. They pack a lot of meaning into every piece of visual art in the game. The game Unpacking is also really interesting here, in that there is an implied story told just by all the things that the main character owns at different points in their life, just from seeing what's in the box after they move. You'll notice when they're in a relationship, when they broke up, when they're expecting a baby, all told through a bunch of objects in the environment, and nothing else. The last thing I want to mention about level design is using your level design as part of a tutorial to show the player how to play. Designers at Valve have given multiple talks about their process, which involves giving the player some new toy or ability like a new gun, and the first thing they do is give it to you in a place where you can pretty much use it unlimited on something like dummy targets in a room with no enemies, no danger, just to see how it works. And then immediately in the next room, maybe they'll give the player some very simple challenges that show off how to use the new thing. If it has multiple uses, you'll usually showcase each of those in its own challenge, and often these challenges are designed specifically to not be achievable any other reasonable way but to use the new ability. So the player's forced to use it, and if they make it past these rooms, then the level designer knows that they've at least got partial understanding and mastery of this new ability, so you can then proceed later on to use it with harder challenges that might either be more intense or combine the use of your new toy with those of your existing abilities prior to getting it. So, for example, let's suppose you're making a shooting game and you give the player a new weapon, say a flamethrower that damages all nearby enemies in a cone of flaming death right in front of you. And you can also burn wooden things like crates or doors with that. So you might first introduce this in a room that looks like a warehouse with a bunch of wooden target dummies set up, maybe some wooden boxes or crates, and essentially unlimited ammunition for your flamethrower so the player can feel comfortable experimenting with it. So then they go around, burn all the things, and then if they run out of ammo, they can recharge right there in the room. Maybe the exit to the room is a locked wooden door, so the player has to use the flamethrower on the door to burn it down in order to proceed, so now you know that they at least have had a chance to play around with it, and they know that it can burn wooden objects. So now maybe they step through the door, but you've designed a narrow hallway, and as soon as they step in, a bunch of weak swarming enemies crawl out and head right toward the player. You know that they probably still have the flamethrower equipped, so the player's first instinct will be to fire it, which will just cook all the enemies coming right at them. So now they'll know how to use it in combat in a situation that works really well in its favor, something where all the enemies are clustered and lined up in front of the player. So now maybe they finish walking down that hallway, and it opens into a room where the player starts on a high-up platform, and there are some very powerful enemies wandering around below them, of the kind that the player would normally have trouble defeating, but they won't attack unless the player drops down to their level, so the player is free to look down and see what's there, and see the threat without worrying about getting attacked. But let's say you've also put some wooden floating boxes at the player's level that have large weights on top of them, so the player can try to burn those boxes with the flamethrower and drop the weights on the enemies, crushing them immediately and letting the player drop down in safety. So by now, the player understands the weapon's direct and indirect combat and environmental uses, and in the next area after that, you could give the same kinds of challenges you gave before, but combining earlier gameplay with knowing that the player also has a flamethrower, and giving opportunities to use it in new hybrid situations where you have the ability to use the flamethrower and then some other ability, just as an example of how this would work. So if you want to learn more about level design, the good news is there's a lot out there on the subject, from books to online articles to videos. Just doing a Google search on level design can find you a lot of things. But in particular, The site GameDeveloper.com has a ton of articles written over the last couple of decades on all kinds of subjects, all free, and GDCVault.com has talks at the Game Developers Conference going back just about as long. There are sometimes videos, sometimes only audio or slides. Occasionally you'll find a recent talk behind a paywall, but everything 2 years or older, and a lot of the more recent things, are also free. So really, those two sites are a great resource for just about anything game development related, but particularly when it comes to level design, you'll find more there than you'll have time to read or watch.
So that's all I have time for today to talk about PvE level design. Come back next time when we'll talk about PvP, which is a whole other thing. But before that, remember to take your assessment so you can get your certification from HP Gaming Garage. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.